Anecdotes of Diogenes, history's craziest philosopher. Diogenes, the insane who is perhaps the sanest of all. Sometimes lucidity looks like madness, and perhaps there has never been anyone as lucid and therefore as uncomfortable as Diogenes. He didn't live in palaces, he didn't write treatises, he didn't seek disciples. He lived in a barrel, he laughed at king, and he used his life as a living provocation. Where others collected titles, he collected quests. Where others sought recognition, he sought truth, not the grandiose truth adorned with elaborate theories and philosophies, but the naked, raw, disconcerting truth, the one revealed in how we eat, how we sleep, how we love, and most importantly, how we deceive ourselves every day trying to appear whole while we are empty inside. Diogenes bothered people, not through aggression, but through presence. He was a merciless mirror in a world addicted to mask, and perhaps that's why they called him crazy, because he refused everything most people spent their lives trying to achieve: status, comfort, approval. He refused not out of contempt, but out of clarity. He saw with clear eyes what others only perceived through desire, and what he saw was a world imprisoned by fragile conventions, by useless vanity, by an incessant search for something that deep down no one could name. Seneca wrote, "Nothing is more admirable than one who admires nothing." And that phrase seems to have been written for Diogenes because he didn't let himself be charmed, neither by gold nor by power nor by fame. His charm was for freedom, for truth, for that which cannot be bought, cannot be flaunted, cannot be sold. And that's what astonished Cicero, observing that man who lived as if the world did not possess him, and perhaps for that very reason was the only truly free one, because everything we don't need to defend makes us light. Everything we are not afraid to lose makes us invincible. Diogenes didn't ask for permission to exist. He simply was raw, direct, irreverent. But behind the provocation was a practical spirituality, a kind of emotional wisdom that many philosophers only theorized about, but he embodied. He didn't seek wisdom in book, but in how he related to his own desire, his own fear, his own solitude. He didn't run from the truth. He lived within it, even when it was too uncomfortable for others to bear. And here arises the question that perhaps bothers more than any anecdote about his life. What if true madness is precisely trying to fit into an incoherent world? What if it's the daily effort to please, to belong, to maintain an image, even when it suffocates us, that reveals our collective insanity? Perhaps Diogenes was just the only one sane enough not to accept living a comfortable lie, and perhaps by looking at him strangely, we are just trying to escape the part of us that recognizes that same dormant lucidity within our chest. When freedom frightens more than emotional imprisonment, there is something profoundly unsettling about observing someone who needs nothing to exist, someone who walks among men without haste, without ambition, without disguise. Diogenes slept in the street, ate what he found, laughed at palaces as one laughs at a poorly staged play. And this, paradoxically, frightened more than any threat, because he exposed a truth that almost no one wanted to admit. Most of us live imprisoned, not by visible shackles, but by a silent fear of not being accepted, of not seeming sufficient, of not fitting into the expectations given to us since birth. True freedom is not the absence of limit. It is the absence of emotional dependence on others' validation. And Diogenes embodied this freedom with a naturalness that pained those who observed him. His existence was an affront, not by violence, but by contrast. He was what no one dared to be: too free, too simple, too true. And that revealed the subtle imprisonment of everyone around him, the imprisonment of those who need titles to be respected, of those who need praise to feel love, of those who need achievements to justify their own existence. The unconscious fear of living with little is not about the lack of things, it's about what it reveals, because when we have nothing to display, what remains is who we are, and many of us cannot bear this encounter, because deep down they suspect that without the mask, without the adornment, without the achievements, perhaps there isn't much there. Perhaps all that remains is an emptiness we try to silence with perch, with distract, with superficial relation. And Diogenes, by living with almost nothing, showed what happens when that fear is overcome, the birth of a freedom that doesn't depend on permission. He was a mirror, and few can bear to see themselves with such clarity. Because he didn't judge, he simply existed, and his existence was, in itself, a critique of a world that trades soul for appearance. It wasn't just about living with little, it was about living with truth, about not needing to please to feel worthy, about not trading dignity for convenience. And that's why his freedom bothered more than any prison, because it made us realize how much we are chained to ideas we never questioned. Perhaps Diogenes' true provocation was not in his words, but in the silence with which he walked among men, needing nothing, and therefore more whole than anyone. And perhaps that is the question he still poses to us, even centuries later. Of all the things you say you need, how many are truly yours, and how many are just chains we learn to call comfort? The lucidity of one who has lost everything, therefore fears nothing. Diogenes had no home. He had no reputation to defend. He had no image to preserve. And perhaps that is precisely why he was so invincible, because nothing that could be taken from him defined who he was. And when someone has nothing left to lose, a freedom is born that is almost unbearable to the eyes of those who still live surrounded by fear. He didn't just accept little. He dissolved the illusion that we need a lot. He didn't rely on external structures. His fortress was internal, and ironically, by losing everything the world calls essential, he became unattainable. Most of us live in fear. Fear of losing status, losing love, losing control. Fear that someone will see beyond the image we try to project. And this subtle fear makes us hostages. Hostages to relationships that no longer make sense. Hostages to jobs that empty us. Hostages to a constant performance that tries to compensate for an old absence. That of simply being who we are without apology. But when all that falls, when the image cracks, when control slips away, something unexpected can emerge. Lucidity. The lucidity of someone who realizes that loss was not the end, but the beginning of a new way of inhabiting oneself. Seneca said, "He who is prepared to lose everything is already invincible." And this sentence carries an immense emotional weight, because it's not about wishing for loss, but about understanding that everything external is transient. And as long as our peace depends on what we don't control, we will live in a tent. But there is a peace that comes from from the awareness that we are not what we possess, nor what we appear to be, nor what others say about it. There is a silent strength in those who have touched rock bottom and returned with clearer eyes, because there, at the bottom, there is nothing left to hide. Diogenes didn't mock people out of contempt. He laughed at illusion. He laughed at those who believed that power is protection. He laughed at those who thought themselves superior for wearing more expensive clothes. He laughed because he saw how fragile everyone was inside, and how much they depended on what could crumble at any moment. And his own lack of possessions was not a burden. It was relief, a relief known only by those who one day found themselves with nothing, yet still whole. Because losing everything sometimes is the only way to finally find oneself. Perhaps this is Diogenes' most radical proposition: to detach from image, from fear, from the constant need to be something for someone. Because when we no longer need to protect an idealized version of ourselves, we begin to relate to life from a more honest place. And this honesty is fierce, not in tone, but in presence. The presence of one who has already lost everything and therefore fears nothing more, not even their own truth. Diogenes' contempt for titles and what it reveals about our insecurity. Diogenes didn't see crown. He saw men with fear, with vanity, with thirst for power. When he mocked kings, philosophers, or merchants, it wasn't out of arrogance. It was from seeing, with eyes stripped of conventions, the farce often hidden behind title. He saw fragility dressed in a toga. He saw insecurity camouflaged by metal. He saw the childlike desire to be noticed amidst the noise of a world obsessed with hierarchy. And this, for him, was comical, but also tragic. Because where everyone sought recognition, he saw escape, a desperate escape from the emptiness many carried and didn't know how to fill. We live trying to prove our worth. We study, accumulate diplomas, climb ladders, hoping that at some point someone will say, "We are enough." But this validation is never enough, because the hole it tries to fill isn't outside. It's inside. Titles, positions, prestige, all of this can look good from afar. But if used as an emotional crutch, it becomes a prison, because it forces us to maintain appearance. It prevents us from making mistakes in peace. It distances us from ourselves, and it transforms us into characters in a play where vulnerability is forbidden. Diogenes tore up that script. He didn't accept roles. He refused the game. And in doing so, he returned to us fundamental question. Who are we when no one applauds? Who are we when there's no audience, no recognition, no label to protect us? This question has no easy answer because it demands that we confront the possibility that we may have built an entire identity based on the need to be seen, not on the desire to be true. Stoicism invites us to exchange appearance for essence, not to isolate ourselves from the world, but not to depend on it to know who we are. Virtue, Epictetus said, needs no witness. It is silent, intimate, firm, and being whole even when no one recognizes it is a form of power that cannot be bought, cannot be conquered. It is cultivated little by little, in the dark, in the solitude of one who no longer needs to impress. Diogenes didn't despise people. He despised disguises, and his contempt was, in fact, an attempt to awaken others, to remind them that the value of a human being is not in what they flaunt, but in what they uphold when everything collapsed. And perhaps that is why he remains so relevant, because in a world that still confuses appearance with identity, he reminds us that the only true nobility is that which no one sees, but which changes everything when it is finally felt. Provocation as a philosophical and emotional tool. Diogenes didn't explain his ideas with long theories. He used gesture, image, the silent scandal of someone who refused to follow the script of blind civility. When he walked with a lit lantern in broad daylight saying, "I am looking for a true man," he wasn't joking. He was shouting with symbols that he had lost faith in the authenticity of human relationship, that he saw a mask on every face, in every word a script, and in every social act a desperate attempt to appear more whole than he felt inside. For Diogenes, provocation was not aggression, it was lucidity in motion. He used the absurd to expose the absurdity that everyone accepted as normal. Extreme luxury, political hypocrisy, intellectual pride, the empty rituals of a daily life that confused etiquette with truth. His anecdotes, often interpreted as madness, were emotional letters addressed to those who still had the courage to think with their own bodies, not just with reason. Because there are questions that can only be asked with a gesture. There are reflections that only arise when we are taken out of our comfort. And deep down, Diogenes forces us to reflect. How many living metaphors do we use every day without realizing? How many rituals do we repeat just to feel we belong? How many patterns do we follow, not out of conviction, out of fear? He tears us away from politeness and returns us to the essential. Who are you without your character? What is left of you when there is no role to play? His provocation was not about others, it was about us, about how much we accept without questioning, about how much of ourselves has been swallowed by conventions that no longer make sense, but which we still follow out of inertia. The human soul gets tired of appearing whole, tired of sustaining an edited version of itself. And this silent exhaustion expresses itself in subtle ways. A nameless sadness, a constant irritation, a feeling of not belonging that persists even among friends. Diogenes touched on that. He disrupted, bothered, but because he wanted to awaken. He wanted people to feel, even for a second, the weight of the layers they carry without knowing why. And if there is something profoundly spiritual in his madness, it is this: the courage to show, with sharp humor and living metaphors, that freedom begins where the fear of looking ridiculous ends. Because sometimes, to find one's own center again, one must go through the pain of stripping oneself bare, stripping away vanity, stripping away pose, stripping away lie. Only then can we return to inhabiting who we are before we were taught to pretend, living with less but feeling more. Diogenes was not a defender of poverty. He was a defender of freedom. He did not reject possessions out of pride, but because he knew how much they could imprison. For him, it wasn't about having less. It was about not being possessed by what one had. What seemed like madness to many was in reality a radical gesture of lucidity. He chose the essential. And that choice made his life light, not from lack, but from presence. He was whole in the now because he didn't need to carry the burden of maintaining appearances or protecting fragile achievement. In a world that teaches us that value lies in accumulation, Diogenes walked in the opposite direction. And this counter-direction was not aesthetic, it was emotion, because living with less also means feeling more, feeling the silence more, feeling the touch more, feeling the moment more. When we are not anesthetized by the constant search for more, we begin to listen to what truly matters. We begin to realize that the essential is always discreet, that the greatest riches don't shout, and that excess often is a sophisticated way of hiding an emptiness we fear to face. Marcus Aurelius echoes this wisdom with sobriety. Little is needed to live well, only the essential, and this essential is not for sale. It is in how we look inward. It is in the decision not to accumulate more than the soul can sustain. It is in the courage to let go of the superfluous, not just physical, but emotional, because there are feelings we carry out of habit, not out of truth. There are guilts we've been taught. There are expectations that were never ours. And there are burdens that only remain because we don't have the courage to let them go. Diogenes' proposal, then, is profoundly practical and profoundly spiritual. It's a daily invitation to let go of a little of what prevents us from feeling, a piece of clothing that no longer makes sense, a relationship sustained by fear, an ideal of success that was never ours, because sometimes the most revolutionary thing is not to conquer something new. It's to let go of what was never necessary. And in that space that opens up, the chance to breathe differently is born, to look at the world with less hate, and to realize that what truly sustains us is not what we have, it's what we feel with wholeness, living with less, feeling more. This was the secret hidden in Diogenes' disconcerting anecdote, and perhaps by listening to them with an attentive heart, we can rediscover within ourselves a freedom that doesn't depend on setting, applause, or approval, only on presence, only on truth, only on the courage to return to what has always been essential and was all along waiting to be seen. Diogenes was not crazy. He was free from illusion. Perhaps the world really does need madmen, but not those who have lost their mind. It needs those who dare to recover lucidity in a time when everything seems anesthetized. Diogenes was that rare type, a man who, by letting go of illusions, touched a type of freedom that few dare to contemplate. He wasn't insane. He was whole. He was rude in form, but precise in essence. He didn't shout to be heard. He lived in a way that couldn't be ignored, and that in itself was a declaration of resistance against the organized hypocrisy that still dictates so many of our choices. Seneca said that one who lives according to reason seems insane in the eyes of the crowd, and isn't that still true today? Someone who refuses to follow the current is viewed with suspicion. Someone who doesn't bow to vanity, who doesn't explain themselves to please, who doesn't perform emotions to be accepted, quickly becomes a target of judgment. Because it's easier to call crazy the one who disrupts our conformity than to face the question they bring us. What if we're all pretending this makes sense, when in reality, we're just afraid to face the void? Cicero, even with all his elegant rhetoric, admitted his perplexity before Diogenes, because there stood a man who seemed to laugh at everything, but without bitterness. He laughed at vanity, but not at the human. He laughed at pose, but not at pain. And perhaps his greatest courage was precisely this, not to become cynical, even seeing up close the falsity with which so many relationships are built. He could have chosen contempt, but he chose laughter, a firm, clean, lucid laugh, a laugh that said, "I know what you're trying to hide, and that's okay. I'm human too. But I choose not to lie to myself." In the end, Diogenes returns us to the question no one wants to hear, but which may be the most important. What if the true delusion is to live trying to please someone who never saw our pain? What if the constant effort to fit in, to reciprocate, conquer, is just an elaborate escape from what truly matters? Who are we when we drop our? What remains when the emotional makeup dissolves? Perhaps what is what he always sought with his lit lantern under a true human being. Someone who needs no adornment to be whole. Someone who, even wounded, chooses to live with an exposed soul. And that, yes, may be the rarest and most lucid form of freedom.